I'm going to show some quite crap images of sculptures. I wanted to put together a sort of survey, kind of a compilation of images of works around the city and places and that, trying to figure out something about this notion of casting stuff in iron or whatever and chucking it into the public sphere. And all through this searching for things to see, I noticed one, and that was all it took for me to notice another, and another. Then all of a sudden they were everywhere, mobs of them, springing from pavements and islands through concrete, rubble and grass in a multitude of shapes, and where sometimes they were beyond mundanity in their specific directional functions, go left, go right. Sometimes their purpose was altogether mysterious, and these unexplained figures lent themselves to my sensibilities through their adoption of sculptural arrangements and forms, yet did so with a confidence in their apparent redundancy which lent them to the category of mute and imposing sculptures which I set out to see in the first place. Friend or enemy, I couldn't tell. Surely their attempt to dictate the movements of people is an indication that they're the tools of some abstract enemy of the abstract noun freedom. Their deceptive joviality a mask for something cruel and hard. The occasional branding of evil utility companies, and surely the way in which their numbers have multiplied in the last few decades suggests that they're at the very least rooted in this time which seems to have either been eaten by the present or which has snowballed into the now. That era of paranoia which defined our, at least my, youth. So, are these figures of the same generation as I? I'm not so convinced about this notion held by some that there's an insidious cast-iron ring encircling our shared spaces. Just look at that face. Look at the way they shyly suggest order. If they could speak, they would say please and thank you. Not like that dastardly cousin, the fence. The imposing wall of steel, the frustrating computer says no of street architecture. I wonder whether their polite personalities give them trouble. I noticed a similar fate in some sculptures. More often than not, they were found scaffolded over and rubbish-strewn, and it occurs with these figures too. Sometimes they appear morose, sometimes bearing the marks of their tormentors or the brunt of their co-workers' laziness, covering shifts for which they were never trained. Sometimes these messengers of the state are collateral damage, beheaded in the streets by the passing revolution. I began to traipse the docks and waterfronts because I know that these spaces are the historical home. Originally used for mooring, at some point a mooring bollard became a bollard. They still often carry traces of the soft curves of their ancestors. According to some historians, the bell bollard has barely changed in design over the last 2,000 years. Their ancestors, even more ancient bells turned traffic bollard, turned fossil, turned Herculaneum artefact. Near Wapping, a more standardised signature is formed. The upturned cannon. Less a symbol of peacetime and more of anti-competitive lobbying practices. During the Napoleonic Wars, cannons taken from captured vessels flooded and saturated the artillery market. Amongst spiralling prices, the Guild of Armourers demanded a non-canonical use for these cannons. Stoppered with oversized balls, they were upended and used thereafter in the noble defence of the pedestrian. Each borough or city has its own favoured style. As is pointed out by bollard expert and cabbie John Kennedy, they can be used as indicators of what is important to regional and central governments. He notes their tendency to suddenly stop where government property ends, although sometimes unexpected places are all too well guarded and surprising characters find themselves flanked by pairs of heavy bodyguards. Perhaps they indicate the vulnerable in addition to the valuable and the venerable. John Kennedy is at least partially right. They seem to be controlled by a magnetic force attracting them to underground piles of gold, gathering in mass in the financial districts, and wherever there are any large marble buildings. While elsewhere, on the edges, they're few and far between. On this note, in wealthy boroughs, they seem to sprout decorous growths, while in others they pretend to a high cultural memory. In the newly gentrified boroughs, they align themselves with famous artists. Bollards undercover as works of contemporary and minimalist art, works of art undercover as bollards, traffic cones undercover as bollards, children's toys undercover as traffic cones. The bollards indicative of the politics of local councils, their limitations laid out in 32 separate sets of streetscape standards. In the bollardian world, things can quickly descend into primal battles over definition. How large may a bollard be? How small? How thin? Or how abstracted might their form be allowed to become? The post is the brother of the bollard, but it's unclear where the line is drawn. Is one made of wood? Is one for making fences? Are bollards always freestanding? If a tree is pollarded, is it akin to a bollard, and is there an etymological root share between these two things which could be whittled down function by function into the same entity? If you cut down a bollard, will it grow back knotted and lumpy? Will they ever escape their phallic associations, or can they learn to embrace them? As my attention becomes consumed by these figures and their distinctions, meanings, and behaviours, no different from public sculptures, really. If you think about it, really? These upright figures morph and grow and populate our curbs and corners.